Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. You're about to experience the other society. Prepare yourself for an independent, unscripted, and unedited conversation about the past, present, and future of the relationship between technology and humanity. Our goal is to share information and inspire action so that technology can be utilized to make our world a better place for everyone. The Other Society is not just a vision, it is a movement, and you can join it. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Marco.
Sean.
Here we are.
Here we are.
We're trying to be ethical today.
Are we? I don't know. We'll see. We'll probably have to define that to start. I was thinking, where are we going with this, right? I mean, this is just a quick round here of introduction. Will take place very shortly because people that are looking at the webcast, they see that it's not just me, you, and another guest, and this is because, Sean, this is one of those The Other Society panels that we have been envisioning for a while. We are excited to kick off number 2, and yeah, talking about smart cities, in my opinion, was a little easier. Not easy, but easier to define, maybe, Sean. And
it's easier.
We need to define it. Yeah, but easy to picture it.
Exactly. So
we know cities.
Yep. So very quickly, for those tuning in to their first The Other Society, Marco and I believe that we have an opportunity to shape the world we want, living with technology rather than the other way around. And that means each of us has a role to play in how we think about technology in our lives, be it at home or at work or in school or wherever. And we want people to think today. And today we did a series on smart cities. And today we're kicking off the series on ethics in society. And Marco, I'm thrilled to have our co-host join us today. He's been on the show before, Kevin Macnish. Kevin, thanks for being on.
Thanks, Sean. It's a pleasure to be back again.
And all the good work you've done to help bring some amazing people together to help us define what are ethics and how they fit into everything we do with technology. So very quickly, I was about to pass it to the amazing folks, but a few words about who Kevin is for those that missed our episodes prior.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Sean. So my name is Kevin Macnish. I am a academic philosopher turned digital ethics consultant in recent years. I now work for a company called Soprasteria in the UK, working in a consultancy capacity. But prior to that, I was in academia for 12 years, working in technology and ethics, which is one of the reasons I've been able to collect such great people, far more prestigious than myself, for our talk today. And so if I hand over firstly to Merv, and then Merv, you can hand the baton on to somebody else to introduce themselves. So why don't you go ahead and tell us who you are, Merv?
Thanks so much, Kevin. My name is Mary Hickok. I'm the founder of AIethicist.org. Like yourself, currently doing consulting and training to public and private organizations on responsible AI design, development, and governance. I teach data science ethics at University of Michigan, and I'm also the research director at Center for AI and Digital Policy. That's more the AI policy and regulatory side. So my work intersects and complementary in many ways. Peter.
Thank you, Merv. Yeah, very nice to be here. I work in the Netherlands at the University of Twente, as you can see behind me, a philosopher by training, and all my work is actually on the impact of technology on human beings and society, and on developing theories to understand the nature of that impact. And the nature of that impact also includes its impact on ethics. And from that background, I'm also quite active in the design lab of the University of Twente, where we try to connect ethics to the design of technologies. And I will move to the University of Amsterdam, actually, October 1. So probably most people who will hear this will hear me as a professor working in Amsterdam. Tom, can I pass the mic to you?
Thank you. My name is Tom Sorrell. I'm a professor at University of Warwick in the UK. I'm also trained as a philosopher. I work across the subject, not just in technology, but I have worked on technology and ethics a lot, mostly connected with the ethics of security, policing, and also on the ethics of different kinds of fusion of databases. I advise the Home Office in the UK on that kind of thing and biometrics. And I advise one of the largest police forces in the UK also on predictive policing using AI. But I'm also involved in AI applications in medical diagnosis. So it's a range.
I think the point you just made, Tom, or I don't know if it was a point specifically, but the things you just described, there's so many things that technology touches in our life. And Peter, you said impact, and all I can think of is action and consequence. Everything we do has some kind of response, and that's certainly true for technology. So, Kevin, when we're looking at ethics, maybe you can kind of get us rolling here on the conversation. Do we need to start with a definition, perhaps?
I think that that's always dangerous asking a philosopher for a definition. I could spend an hour talking through that one and only get to the first word. I mean, broadly speaking, I look at ethics as being the difference between right and wrong, what we do, why we do it, what's motivating, what's justifying our actions, and so on. But I think particularly when it comes to things like technology and so on, it could be really helpful rather than come out with abstract definitions to try and think about hard contexts. Where are we seeing ethics today? Where is technology raising ethical issues for society? And I think that might help it to really sort of solidify in people's minds what we're talking about. So why don't I throw that one over, and Tom, start with you. What do you think is one of the biggest ethical challenges facing society at the moment as a result of technology?
Well, I think that there are lots of different kinds of issues, not all of them very unfamiliar to people who've written about technology. Clearly, there's the whole anti-social side of social media and the wide use of the internet. That's very carefully studied, and there's legislation now, especially in the UK, to control online harm. But in addition to that, I think there are significant challenges that are posed by automation in employment and the way in which automation, robotics, AI might make certain kinds of human skill redundant. And I think there's also an extremely important area to work on, which is the automation of weaponry. That's particularly interesting and maybe highly relevant given today's circumstances.
Thanks, Tom. Peter Paul, how about yourself?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I agree with Tom. Maybe I would see impacts of technologies, challenges of technologies in two dimensions. So one is the impact they have on society, and the other is maybe really the impact they have on ethics itself and the ways in which we could do ethics in the first place, right? So the societal impact, I think typically the digital revolution is causing a lot of challenges for our society. Tom already mentioned a few of them. I think also the broader picture of AI, and I'm sure Murph will say more about that. Technologies are starting to change how we think. They help us to make sense of the world. They help us to make decisions. They help us to understand each other, ourselves. And that's quite a fundamental impact. The basic infrastructure for our cognition is changing. How can we take responsibility for that? And another societal impact for me would also be, of course, the future of the Earth. The whole phenomenon of global warming, and also the increasing need maybe to tackle that technologically. If the policymakers can deal with it, should the engineers solve it then? So what about climate engineering and the risks involved in that? And I think, and then I'll stop. On top of this, these very two examples also show that we might also need to revise our ethical frameworks themselves to deal with this. I mean, when our thinking starts to change as a result of technology, how can we use key concepts like autonomy or, I don't know, judgment that are very central in ethics? Or when we do geoengineering, what is a moral right? Do ecosystems have moral rights as well? Or how can our democracy open up also to include non-human entities? Should we? And so big challenges for ethics itself as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Peter Paul. And Murphy, how about you? What are your views?
I totally agree with what Peter Paul and Tom already mentioned. I can talk about the AI in particular and impact on fundamental rights, democracy, and rule of law separately in future questions. But I think if I was to look at a higher level, for me, techno-solutionism and techno-determinism with these emerging technologies is one of the biggest issues, that we have certain technologies developing and we're using it as a hammer to some of society's biggest problems. I think there's benefit to a lot of the technologies where you use it right and in the right place, but our fundamental questions of just because we can, should we, is this the right solution, keeps coming back for me. And then just at a related level, what does that mean for equity and social justice in general when you try to embed these technologies in every way? Does that actually narrow the gap in social justice and equity, or are we actually using it to protect the status quo at best or deepen the divides and the gaps across the society at worst?
Excellent, thank you.
Kevin, I want to jump in because we may actually touch this in other conversation that we had, but I like to look at history, and I'm thinking, like, if we ever, maybe, I don't know, I wasn't there 200-300 years ago or earlier, but I feel like, especially in the last part of our past, maybe we never talk about ethics as much as we're doing now. I'm wondering if, we talk about technology and ethics, but shouldn't have ethics always driven our decision in an ideal world, right? I mean, something to think about, and maybe is it a wake-up call now that we have to control something that is not just human?
I'm not sure that I agree that ethics is is peculiar to us. I think that especially through Catholicism and other religious traditions, there's been a lot of reflection on all kinds of phenomena going back a long way. For example, and this is something Kevin knows a lot about, just war theory, which is very old compared to the kind of technology we're discussing. So I'm not sure that ethics is a kind of new invention.
I didn't mean that, but I mean maybe more discuss in the public nowadays.
Well, yeah, I mean, more people discuss things, I guess, but it's certainly been discussed by intellectuals a lot.
Yeah.
And I think when it's popularly discussed, when ethics is popularly discussed, there's sometimes quite a lot of difficulty in figuring out what people mean by it. I think
that the whole digital revolution has really given rise to a lot more ethical discussion about technology than it had ever been. I mean, the field that I'm in used to be quite an exotic field within philosophy of technology. I mean, that's not to be taken seriously, right? And now it is mainstream. And I think it is because of the huge impact that the digital revolution has on us. And I think here ethics also sometimes takes an almost political role, right? I mean, the discussion about AI is also typically which ethics. And it's not that there is only one ethics. Should we have the ethics of the Western part of the world, where basically all your data are owned by big tech companies that try to consume to make you buy more stuff? Or should we go to the eastern part of the world where your data are owned by the state? Or should we have a European model, the third way, as they call it, more human-centered AI, democratic AI? I mean, there are values behind the technologies that are designed and how they are implemented. And that's what we are discovering now ever more explicitly.
I agree with that, but I think that, there's a tendency to frame some questions as if they are largely questions of equity and, whether there are techno have-nots and techno rich people, techno wealthy people. whether there's big disparities of this kind. I think there are other aspects of ethics, especially in the kind of post social media environment, that are very interesting and that are not to do with social structures particularly. You know, one very important element of ethics, in my opinion, in this space is gaming. You know, gaming introduces a lot of bad ethics, because gaming introduces the idea of winning over people, shaming people, competing with people in lots of different ways, and also doing it anonymously. There's a lot of a kind of gaming culture in certain kinds of activity on the part of, say, Anonymous or WikiLeaks. There's also a very large culture going right back to the foundation of the internet, of not taking anything seriously, and of sending up, making fun of things ad infinitum, often making fun of things from an engineer's perspective, which is also a little worrisome. So I think there are lots of different elements going on here that are not always to do with, you know, the kinds of frameworks that we apply broadly in talking about liberalism, or talking about the conflict between liberalism and autocracy, let's say. It's a big, huge area full of interest, full of peculiarity, I think.
I think that raises a really interesting question, Tom, when you're talking about sort of social media and how people interact. And I don't want to restrict it to this, but take it out more broadly with technology as a whole. And that's it. Is it the technology that raises the ethical problems, or is it the people who use the technology that raise the ethical problems? Because we talk frequently about things like AI ethics, or ethics and technology generally. And is it the technology itself that's somehow changing things, or is it the people ultimately that are doing it? That's a broad one, but I'll throw it. Peter Paul, let's throw it to you first, because yeah.
The first book that I wrote was called "What Things Do."
There you
it was actually about technologies doing more than we think they do, and of course they cannot do things like humans do. I mean, they don't have conscience or something. They can't make a plan. But I do believe that a lot of the ethical issues that we see in our society are not simply caused by humans. Technologies, as soon as they enter a practice, always start to do unexpected things. And I think that's what we have to face. I mean, we never thought that using the fossil fuels at such a scale would now lead to ideas about geoengineering, and that would require that we develop new ethical frameworks to deal with the moral rights of the planet, or that we need a value to express the value of the planet, which always used to be simply the self-evident place that we live on and that didn't even need our attention, right? So technologies do more than we design into them. It's not only the use of technologies, it's the design of technologies also that causes things. And there is a lot of emergent phenomena. As soon as we start using technologies, new things happen that nobody had ever foreseen.
And Merv, I'd like your perspective on this as well, because as I'm hearing these conversations, all I can go to is the data, right? We have so much more data, perhaps even so much more information now, that we think we can make better decisions, and perhaps we can make more ethical decisions, more moral decisions, or perhaps we're still ignoring the ethics of this and just using data to drive things to somebody's objective. And that's why I asked the question early on: what is a definition? Whose ethics are we building for? Is it the regional ethical standpoint? Is it a religious ethical standpoint? Is it a social media groups ethical standpoint? Who are we serving in our decision making? And more specifically, back to you, Merv, is it how does the data playing a role in all of this?
I think we should also approach data and the neutrality of or objectivity of data and technology with a grain of salt. I think at this point we're all aware that the data, as it relates to humans, whether it's created by humans, collected by humans, it's about humans, it's about human behavior, and interactions, it's never unbiased. There is always an element of majority ideas usually represent, or structural ideas represented in that data. So when we say we should make data-driven decisions, I think it's worth challenging that a bit as well. Whose data? Who gets to decide upon which data to use? Who gets to collect that data, and who gets to be surveilled and be controlled by this data all the time? If you're talking about ethics and impact on society, there's usually a repeating one side that gets to make those decisions, whether it's the states, whether it is the more powerful with more resources, whether now more of big technology companies as they have emerged. There's that one side, and there is the other side who is constantly and increasingly and in a ubiquitous manner now who gets to be impacted and subject to decisions. I mean, we have terms like data subjects right now that we're talking about humans as being subject to data and data-driven decisions. So I would like to open up that question a bit and challenge the idea of data as a raw, neutral, objective concept as well.
That's a great.
Maybe I could add something to what Merv has just said. I was at a little workshop run for a project of mine in the last couple of days, and one of the issues we were talking about was the control of misinformation about COVID by the very large social media platforms. And they were talking about all of the different things that they were trying to do. But they said, as if this was a pitch for sympathy, just remember the scale of messages on Meta, on Facebook. Just remember, it's in the hundreds of millions of messages. And to come back to Kevin's question, whose fault is that? That is part of the way these platforms are designed. The more users, the better. And that design of social media to accommodate as many users as possible is a recipe for losing control and indulging these bad aspects of gaming and other misbehavior, so that the social media companies are reduced, in their view, to having to put little patches on things just to keep up. One mustn't pity the social media companies for the position they're in. It's entirely their own fault and quite predictable. So I think that's an aspect. The sheer scale of data is connected to a lack of control, predictably connected to a lack of control, especially the control of malicious behavior.
May I add something to that, Kevin? Would you like to proceed? Yeah. So I'm just back from a week in Paris, where at UNESCO I'm chairing the World Commission for the Ethical Science and Technology, and I just want to bring in that dimension, the worldwide dimension of these questions. I think what I've really learned there is that we need to tackle the ethical issues on a global scale, because geoengineering, the digital revolution, it has an impact all over the world. And what you discover in such a context, of course, is that there is not one single ethical framework. And typically that our current emphasis in the Western world that we all come from is on the individual rights, autonomy, etc. But in almost all other parts of the world, that is much less so. And that's also really interesting. If we try to reach an agreement and to write a good report, to bring together the perspective of the individual and, more forms of communal thinking. And of course, the two go together. I would say for us, society consists of individuals often, and for people from other parts of the world, society is what makes it possible for an individual to live as an individual. It's two sides of the same coin, but trying to bring these two perspectives together, I think, is super important.
I can see Tom desperate to come back at you on that one, Peter Paul. But before he does, I just want to bring Mirko back in and just say, because one of the things we've seen over the last 4 years or so, Merve, I think, is that AI ethics has, particularly codes in AI ethics, have proliferated. I think there are over 200 of them now. There was a website set up a few years back just to chart the number of them coming out. And of course, these are global AI ethics codes. They're coming from China, they're coming from Africa, they're coming from Europe and the States and everywhere else. One of the things that struck me about that is that a lot of the principles they come out with are very, very similar. And so I think it's an interesting, just to push back slightly on Peter Paul's point there about the difference that we're experiencing around the world. What would your position be, Merve, on that? Are you seeing these distinctions coming out, or are you actually seeing a coming together, a pooling of ideas? I think Charles S. wrote about this about 20 years ago, saying the internet would lead to a coalescing of values and virtues.
My platform, AIethicist.org, started years and years ago with that increasing number of principles and frameworks coming up. And I actually looked at a number of them and written about them. I would disagree a bit that they are global in they are reflective of all global perspectives and values. If you actually look at the numbers and the detail of where these principles are coming from, 200 plus, as you mentioned, and who was involved in the development of them, and the institutions that developed them, and the gender and racial balance or breakdown of who was involved in developing them, you see a very high number or percentage of still Western society, Western values represented in that, a very, very high number of males versus females, let alone a further, if you're talking about binaries at minimum. And we're seeing a similar thing in terms of the policy framework as well. A lot of the policy frameworks that are coming up, AI policy frameworks, are still West-centric and very much focused on European values or US values or democratic values, which might be the model, but cannot be the only model. I think UNESCO is one of the better and best examples in this so far, as it represents and as its recommendations and its perspectives adopted by 193 countries last year with its AI and ethics recommendations. I think we really need to be mindful of the diversity of the world, of our globe, and the societies that have been there for thousands of years. They have survived for a reason, and they're bringing that value. So just focusing on one part of the world and just these principles and the values proliferating accordingly is dangerous for our diversity as well. So yes, there are so many of those documents and principles, but I think it's really helpful to look at actually who's behind them and who was involved.
Okay, so there's actually almost a quiet Western colonialism going on of values.
Very, very much so.
To impact. Okay, thank you. So Tom, I leapt in there and cut you off. You go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to push back a little bit on this idea that a Western approach to things is necessarily at odds with diversity, because there isn't a single Western approach to things. There's an extremely varied number of theories in the West, including many. For example, Peter Paul was talking about an association of Western theory with individuals. There are plenty of Western theories, European theories, that are nothing of the sort, that are primarily communitarian, that say that the individual is less important, even less real than communities. Hegel, for example, a good European. So I think there tends to be a caricature of a single Western approach to many of these questions. Of course, when it comes to regulation and principles that are going to be used actually to regulate the operation of AI, it's going to be a certain technologically educated, probably global in the bad sense, elite who are making the decisions, and who are probably more uniform than Western thought actually is. So give Western thought a little bit of credit. You know, Aristotle is nothing like Descartes. And there are many, many, many varieties of literature and thought that are nothing to do with this idea that we're all talking about liberalism.
I totally agree,
Please.
Tom. But that there is, of course, a difference between our academic tradition and how public discourse takes shape. And then I would also totally agree that maybe also within the Western world, there is a lot more variety than it would only about liberalism. But the mainstream intellectual discourse, and also what I see at UNESCO, what comes from the Western world and what comes from the other 4 regions of the world, is that the story about the individual comes from us. and that's
Yes,
the first thing that we say, which is not wrong. Yeah.
But that may be because of a homogenization that takes place when global elites talk to one another. They occupy niches that are developed by a certain fairly artificial, mapping of positions.
And it's maybe also an intellectual discourse that is sometimes too remote from what people in the street are really thinking about. I mean, I actually did an ethical analysis of the app that was introduced by the government in the Netherlands to detect if you could have been affected with the virus. And then we had an expert panel, and that was only about autonomy and freedom, and it should be voluntary. But when we asked people in the street, they said, "Oh, all the privacy measures in the app are a reason not to use it, because we do want to share our place and our own location data so that the health authorities can know where the virus is, and we do want to share the list of contacts that we have so that people can get a notification." So also within the Western world, of course, there is solidarity and there is community thinking. Yeah.
So Kevin, I want to bring it to you, because I know we have a question on how society can be part of this, right? Kind of to your other point, but in a different way, is technology driving or society driving? Because I look at this and I think, if you look at how a company defines its business, they'll set up a vision statement, right, with a grand scheme or a grand view of what they want to be, and that's pretty stable. And then they'll create a mission statement that's a little more fluid, might look 3 to 5 years out, and might change over time. I'm wondering, do we as a society have a vision for what ethics are? And is there a mission that we follow that might change over time for what ethics look like? And do we have to compromise perhaps even in some of our ethical decisions to address near-term challenges versus long-term sustainability? And so maybe to bring it to the third question you have, how does society actually help shape that? Or who is shaping that? Is it the tech companies or technology, or the society themselves?
Absolutely, Sean. I mean, yeah, you've touched on some really fundamental issues there, haven't you, with how society engages with this. And one of the things I was reflecting on as we've been talking, going back to some of those issues around ethics, and Marco raised the issue about history and so on. When the car, the automobile, was first introduced, it was seen as an environmental benefit to society because it didn't leave the mess that horses left. And cars didn't typically die in the street and have to be left for about a week before you then removed the carcass. And so everyone thought this was fantastic, and cars were coming along and changing this. And obviously now we see the impact of the internal combustion engine and what that's the impact that's had on the environment in a totally different way. But in the meantime, the car has just changed society so radically in ways that we couldn't have imagined before, whereby it just doesn't take too much to think about just driving for an hour to go somewhere, or commuting long distances into work. And it's similarly, Peter Paul was just talking about the track and trace apps and some of the issues around track and trace. You go back 100 years to the Spanish flu and the impact that had on society, and now look at how we've responded, possibly taking in Murphy's earlier point about techno-determinism, with looking to apps, looking to technology to try and help us with these, with the pandemic. And so there's a question there whether it was necessary or not. But I think it's just really interesting to see that interaction between society and technology over time, that it's not a linear progression. Would that it were, and that society's attitudes are also not linear. They tend to shape, they tend to change. So I was living in the States when 9/11 happened, and shortly after 9/11, there was an attitude of privacy schmivacy, let's throw privacy out the window, we just need to catch the guys who are behind 9/11. And the intelligence agencies should have as much access as they want to everybody's information. This picks up on some of Tom's stuff about security. 11 years later, Edward Snowden comes along, and all of a sudden the pendulum pivots in entirely the opposite direction. And now there's an attitude that the intelligence agencies have gone too far. And then probably, I think there was a survey about 5 years after Snowden where things started to level back out again. So it's very, very difficult to try and establish, you say, what society believes and where society thinks it's going. I'll let that one hang. Somebody looks like Tom. You look like you wanted to come in.
Well, it seems to me that one of the things that society and intellectuals can both latch onto is the concept of harm, and also to examples of harm. So, to take some examples that are very current in Britain at the moment, the fact that some children are got to commit suicide because of the way that their body image is mocked, or their posts on social media are mocked, the way people are deprecated, for example, that kind of thing. The fact that people who are suicidal are encouraged by certain groups on the internet to commit suicide, as if they were standing at the bottom of a building and somebody was on a ledge about to jump off. This social media acts just like the crowd at the bottom of the building, saying, "Jump, jump." And why? For my personal entertainment, it seems. So if we come up with some examples of things that are regarded as harmful, that is where ethics comes in. Ethics is largely to do with harm. It's not only to do with harm, but it's largely to do with harm. And that's, I think, where society can also, profitably discuss things. And harm means, injury, reducing capacity, taking away life, and other things.
You mentioned, Kevin, sorry to cut you in, but you mentioned, you mentioned the interactions between society and technology, and Peter Paul kind of alluded to the socio-technical aspects of these systems, where we need to recognize how this bigger technology is, technological systems operate in a larger societal context and becoming very ubiquitous in our lives, where we cannot really purely depend on technically based solutions to solve our problems. And we need to be really mindful of the feedback loop between technology and society, where you put out a technology like AI, as they manifest themselves, for example, in mass surveillance or social media platforms, that technology eventually starts shaping the behavior of those who are interacting with it or who are being subject to it. And then that behavior becomes data points and creates this feedback loop for the future outcomes of the technology as well. For example, if you know that you're going to be subject to facial recognition technology, that's 24/7 almost, and someone is going to know where you are, where you've been all the time, you might change your behavior, be more controlling of where you've been, what you said. Similarly, if you know that your future employers will have access to every single social media posts and public information that you put out and make their decisions about that, you might change your behavior and kind of self-filter. Tom said he's involved in predictive policing. There's a lot of, interaction and feedback loops between how technology starts impacting and shaping the policing behavior and what that means for society. I think we're looking at a bigger context, like how these big technologies operate in a bigger context and what that means for society's future as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, Peter Paul.
Yeah, maybe I would say that indeed, I would then say also in that larger context, one role for ethics is to somehow prevent harm. But I also like to emphasize that ethics can also do something more positive. So you could say negative ethics tries to keep out what we do not want, but there's also something like positive ethics that tries to shape the conditions for what we do want. More value-based ethics. And I would also see all the attempts to do value-based design, guidance ethics, etc., as ways to not only make sure that we do not see too many accidents, too many things that we do not want, but that we accept the fact that we live in a technological world. We cannot avoid the influence of technology on human beings and on society. And we have to make sure that the values that we really cherish, that we find important, that we connect them to the design, the implementation, and the use of new technologies. So maybe that's what this podcast ultimately is about, actually, Kevin.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Peter Paul. That's a great place, I think, to close, because I think a lot of what we're going to be dealing with in the rest of the series is precisely that question about how do we start to design in ethics to our technologies. As Tom said, if you take the design of social media, it's designed in such a way that it encourages this sort of real life as entertainment kind of perspective. Or as Merv said, the design of some of these codes of conduct and whatever can bring in a sort of neo-colonial fashion, some views and attitudes which are typical of certain elite groups within certain societies, I think. And so I think you're spot on, Peter Paul, that there's that question about how do we put the guardrails in place? How do we ensure that when we go forward, we can limit the harm, as Tom says, that we're risking, and that we can open up the guardrails for the future life that we're looking for and that we would want for society.
And this is, Kevin, exactly what we will be exploring in the future. I was afraid that this was going to be a very wide conversation, and of course 40 minutes or 45 minutes is not even scratching the surface, but I think it was a great start, a lot of direction that we can follow in our future conversation on the topic. And again, the next one will focus more on the technology side of the ethics and the digital society, and then the next one, the third, will be more focused on the societal aspect of that. So this was a great start. I am definitely here for much more. I'm starving for more, actually. And I want to thank you all for your time. This was incredible.
Welcome.
Yeah, and I'd say a ton of topics within this conversation. I suspect, Marco, we're going to be looking back and referring to this introduction episode many times.
It's a Gremlin episode. We'll get many more multiplying.
Yeah. And Kevin, I just want to say you painted the visual picture of guardrails, and for me, those are meant to be skateboarded and snowboarded on. So you kind of push the limits with
always push the edges, Sean.
That's right.
Is it through Californian?
That's right. Exactly. So for those watching or listening, there'll be links in the show notes for this episode and on the series page for our guests' profiles, and you can connect with them there if you have questions or thoughts, and other resources that they and we find interesting and think will help you continue, or at least hopefully this started you thinking, and hopefully those links will help continue the thought process of a better society with ethics in our digital world. So thanks everybody for listening. Stay tuned to more of The Other Society here on ITSP Magazine.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of The Other Society. If you learned something new and this discussion made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.